Coruscant, 19 BBY. The Galaxies Opera House. Below the Chancellor's private box, a Mon Calamari ensemble performs Squid Lake, an aquatic ballet, vivid and deliberately distracting, filling the house with sound and light, while 60 meters above the stage floor, the most dangerous man in the galaxy tells a story to a young man whose wife is pregnant. Palpatine calls it the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. A Sith Lord, he explains, so powerful that he could use the Force to influence the midi-chlorians to create life, and to keep the ones he cared about from dying. Plagueis taught his apprentice everything he knew. Then, one night, the apprentice killed him in his sleep. Palpatine delivers every line of this in the measured register of a man recounting mythology, historical, third person, respectfully distant from himself. Ancient wisdom, lost to the ages, a tragedy. What Anakin Skywalker doesn't know, sitting in that box, is that the man telling this story is the apprentice, that the techniques being described as legend are techniques the narrator has had over a decade to refine in private, that the nightmares Anakin has been having for months, Padme dying in childbirth, screaming his name, beyond his reach, are exactly the fear Palpatine designed this entire conversation around. Later in the same film, Palpatine makes the offer concrete. The dark side of the Force, he tells Anakin, is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural. Anakin hears this as a door being opened for the first time. The prosecution's argument is that Palpatine had walked through that door years earlier, and the performance in the private box was specifically designed to obscure that fact. No canon source explicitly confirms Palpatine performed life force drain during the Clone Wars era, or that he drained Padme. That gap exists, and it will be addressed. But a gap in confirmation isn't the same as a gap in evidence, and the evidence, assembled from what canon does establish, builds a case that takes the theory far past speculation. Before the Clone Wars timeline can be argued, the Plagueis inheritance has to be established cleanly, because the Legends canon distinction cuts through almost every discussion of this theory, and usually obscures more than it clarifies. James Luceno's 2012 novel Darth Plagueis is the richest single text on Palpatine's master. It covers the full span of their relationship, Plagueis' approach to midi-chlorian manipulation, the mechanics of how he attempted to exert control over life force at scale, the specific stages of Palpatine's training. It's also Legends, reclassified after the 2014 Disney reboot. Any detail sourced exclusively from that novel sits outside the canon evidentiary record. The script will treat it that way. What is in the canon record? Palpatine's description of Plagueis in the opera scene is canon, delivered in Revenge of the Sith, an unretconned canon film, in dialogue that post-2014 canon has consistently treated as factually accurate rather than as fabrication. George Lucas initially suggested the account might be a deliberate lie calibrated to Anakin's fears. That reading didn't hold. Canon Wikipedia's entry on Plagueis describes him as having mastered the dark side of the Force to such an extent that he could cheat death and create life. That formulation isn't characterizing Palpatine's sales pitch as mythology. It's the canon encyclopedia affirming the substance of what Palpatine described. The ability to influence midi-chlorians, to sustain life, to prevent death through force manipulation. Canon treats all of it as real. Palpatine was Plagueis' apprentice and killed him. This is unambiguous in the opera scene. Plagueis taught his apprentice everything he knew. Palpatine is the apprentice. He killed his master. He inherited what Plagueis had built. The third confirmed canon fact, the one that anchors the entire mechanical argument, is that force drain is real, learnable, and documented in the Disney canon record. Wikipedia's canon entry defines it as the draining of force energy from an individual into oneself, classified as a dark side ability practiced by various figures throughout Star Wars history. It entered the Disney canon record in 2015 through Chuck Wendig's Aftermath trilogy, published explicitly under the new canon banner. The Rise of Skywalker then placed it on screen in terms that removed any ambiguity. Palpatine drains Rey and Ben Solo's combined life force in the film's climax, depicted as phantom white streams flowing from their chests into his palms. restoring him visibly toward full power. The technique works against two individuals simultaneously. It works without physical contact. It draws life force from the target in a way the target can't prevent through physical resistance. Wikipedia's canon entry on force drain does not limit the ability to force dyad users. It defines it as a general dark side ability. The dyad bond between Rey and Ben amplified the scale and speed of what Palpatine extracted. The two of them together represented an exceptional concentration of force energy. The underlying technique isn't exclusive to dyadic force connections. A Sith Lord practicing the ability against a single individual, in controlled private conditions over years of refinement, would be using a less spectacular version of the same documented canon mechanic. By Rise of Skywalker, Palpatine could perform large-scale force drain against multiple targets simultaneously. That's the established endpoint. The case being made here asks when he developed sufficient mastery to perform it reliably, and whether that mastery preceded Revenge of the Sith. The timeline math provides the foundation. In Legends, specifically the Lucino novel, Plagueis survived until the night Palpatine won the Supreme Chancellorship, approximately 32 BBY. Palpatine killed him in his sleep at the moment of political triumph, completing the Rule of Two's transfer of power at the exact instant his public persona reached its apex. Under that timeline, from 32 BBY to the beginning of the Clone Wars in 22 BBY, Palpatine had a 10-year window of solo development with whatever techniques Plagueis had transferred. Canon is more ambiguous on the date, but not more protective of Plagueis' longevity. Canon Wikipedia places the death somewhere in the 54 to 32 BBY range. Several canon timeline analyses suggest it happened earlier than 32 BBY, possibly concurrent with the period Palpatine acquired Darth Maul as his next apprentice, which would place Plagueis' death closer to 40 BBY. Under that reading, from Plagueis' death to the start of the Clone Wars isn't 10 years, it's 18. The prosecution's argument holds in either continuity. The canon timeline strengthens it. The Legends novel contains a claim, low confidence as a canon source but worth naming, that at the time of Plagueis' death, Palpatine had absorbed the technique in theory but couldn't execute it at his master's level of skill. A separate and directly conflicting analysis argues the opposite, that Palpatine eventually far eclipsed Plagueis in raw force power. Both positions exist in the literature, and they genuinely conflict. Canon doesn't settle the disagreement. What canon settles is the endpoint. Successful force drain against multiple individuals simultaneously, on screen, in a canon film. Whatever the limitations were at 32 BBY or 40 BBY, they clearly weren't permanent. The technique was refined somewhere across the decades between Plagueis' death and the events of Rise of Skywalker. The Clone Wars represent the most controlled, least scrutinized, most force-intensive window in that span. 4 years, 22 BBY to 19 BBY, during which the conditions for undetected force practice were arguably better than at any other point in Palpatine's life. Understanding why requires running 2 tracks simultaneously across those 4 years, the political track and the force track. Because Palpatine was advancing both in parallel, and each political escalation created specific conditions the force work required. The infrastructure started before the first battle. In 24 BBY, the Emergency Powers Act passed as an amendment to the Galactic Constitution, 2 years before Geonosis, during the Separatist Crisis. Palpatine was simultaneously manufacturing from both sides. The act granted the Chancellor authority to act directly, without going through the Senate and its committee structures. On the political track, expanded executive power. On the force track, reduced institutional scheduling, fewer mandatory appearances, fewer people with routine visibility into what the Chancellor was doing between Senate sessions. Then, 22 BBY, Geonosis, which starts the war in a single engagement. Also in 22 BBY, in the Senate chamber shortly after, Senator Amidala is absent from a critical floor session. Junior Representative Jar Jar Binks stands in her place and delivers a speech swaying the Senate to grant Palpatine emergency powers broad enough to restructure the Republic's constitutional balance in real time. The official Star Wars website describes this as a move that would have a profound impact on the Galactic Republic, a description that turns out to be among the more restrained understatements in the franchise's history. Those expanded powers gave Palpatine the authority to act in military matters without Senate approval, to conscript forces, to declare martial law, to take direct executive control across functions previously distributed through committees. The Emergency Powers Act also eliminated the Chancellorship's term limits for the duration of the Separatist crisis. His position was now open-ended. The war would last as long as the crisis lasted. He controlled the crisis from both sides. Consider what that meant structurally. The Separatist military answered to Count Dooku, who answered to Darth Sidious, who was Palpatine. The Republic's Grand Army answered to the Supreme Chancellor. Palpatine was directing the tempo, the scale, and the geographic distribution of a galaxy-wide conflict simultaneously from both command structures. He could accelerate a front, stall a campaign, manufacture a crisis, or manufacture a resolution. The conflict's duration was a variable he controlled. He ended it in 19 BBY, the same year Vader was built. The emergency powers had a secondary effect that rarely gets examined in force terms. Progressive emergency authority eroded the Senate oversight apparatus across all 4 years. By 19 BBY, Palpatine's discretionary time, hours that weren't accountable to committee appearances, Senate sessions, or formal executive obligations, was substantially larger than it had been in 24 BBY. 4 years of constitutional erosion, each year granting slightly more executive autonomy than the last, produced a chancellor whose private hours were largely his own. The political track was creating laboratory time. Most of those unmonitored hours were on Coruscant. Palpatine spent nearly the entire Clone Wars as Supreme Chancellor based in the capital, which is also where the Jedi Temple sat. Both institutions, the highest political authority and the highest force-sensitive authority in the Republic, occupied the same planet. The Jedi Temple was within distance that any other Sith Lord might have found untenable. Palpatine was there for 4 years, practicing what Plagueis had taught him, and the Jedi never detected a single moment of it. That failure wasn't passive negligence, it was structural, and it had a specific mechanism. Mace Windu created Form 7, the lightsaber combat style called Vapad, and the description of it from Wikipedia's Legends entry, drawing from Matthew Stover's novel Shatterpoint, is precise. Vapad is more than a fighting style. It's a state of mind, a path that leads through the penumbra of the dark side. The mechanics across multiple lore sources are consistent. A practitioner of Vapad channels both their own aggressive feelings and the dark side energy of their opponents, redirecting it through the body rather than resisting it, using the attacker's own darkness as fuel. Sources differ on whether the form required Windu to draw on genuine dark side emotions of his own, or primarily to redirect his opponent's dark energy back at them. But across either reading, the practice ran closer to the dark side than any other Jedi discipline the Order tolerated. Previous Jedi who attempted the form either fell to the dark side or abandoned it. Windu was its only living master. He sat on the Jedi High Council. He trained with Vapad on Coruscant. The Council was aware of the practice and continued to regard him as one of their most senior members. The prosecutorial point runs in 2 directions. First, toward the Council's detection capability. If the Jedi High Council tolerated a lightsaber master who regularly channeled dark side energy as a combat discipline, inside their own institution, on Coruscant, they'd already accepted that dark side force channeling could coexist with Jedi allegiance. A council that permitted this practice in its own chamber couldn't maintain a clean detection threshold for dark side activity across the same planet. Their force sensitivity was calibrated toward the dark side as a binary alarm, but Vapad's existence inside the Order had already complicated that binary. Ambient dark side force activity in Palpatine's private quarters, blocks from the Jedi Temple, was the kind of signal this institution had trained itself to contextualize, rather than respond to. Second, toward what Vapad uniquely gave Windu. He was specifically the council member who moved against Palpatine with conviction in Rotz's final act. Where his colleagues were still deliberating, Windu sensed that Palpatine was too dangerous to leave alive. The dark side attunement Vapod required appears to have given Windu a perceptual edge his colleagues didn't have, a finer sensitivity to exactly the kind of force presence Palpatine was concealing. If that inference holds, it means the rest of the Council, operating entirely on light side sensitivity, was even more structurally blind to Palpatine's force activities than the one Jedi who developed dark side adjacent awareness. And even Windu didn't identify him until 19 BBY. The dark side clouding the Force, the inability to perceive clearly. Yoda's admission in Rotz is a confession about structural failure, not incidental intelligence lapses. Those conditions had been engineered. Polis Massa is an airless asteroid belt in the Outer Rim, far enough from Coruscant to be practically unreachable in real time. The medical facility there is a Rebel Alliance base in later years. In 19 BBY, it functions as an isolated outpost, staffed and equipped but remote. Padme arrives after Mustafar. The medical droids scan her immediately. She was physically injured on Mustafar. Anakin force-choked her, visible on screen, her feet leaving the ground, his hand raised, the compression of her throat documented in the film. The physical trauma from that act is real. Potential airway damage, oxygen deprivation, vascular stress. She then watched the man she loved massacre children, turn against his closest friends, and attack her when she tried to reach him. The psychological devastation of that sequence isn't a small thing. Both the physical injury and the emotional destruction are legitimate, present, documented. The medical droids scan for all of it. They find the injuries, presumably. They treat what they can. Then the lead droid says, "We don't know why. She has lost the will to live. We need to operate quickly if we are to save the babies." Bail Organa's response is the scene's most revealing beat. Babies? Not a question about Padme, a response to information he didn't have. The droids are operating on a woman they've just told is dying without cause, in a facility designed specifically for this kind of intervention, and the most medically precise answer they can produce is that she no longer wishes to live. Not cardiac failure, not neurological collapse from the force choke, not complications from the birth, absence of will. The droid can scan biological systems, midi-chlorian counts, organ function, nervous system integrity, blood chemistry. The instruments in a Polis Massa medical facility are built for biology, not for the Force. Force drain doesn't leave a biological signature. It operates through the Force, draining the target's connection to it, the animating energy running beneath the physical form, in a way that produces biological consequence without biological cause. The organs fail because the force sustaining them is gone. The instruments scan the organs and find them failing without understanding why, because the cause isn't in the organs. That's not a theory-specific invention. That's how force drain works in the only confirmed canon instance of its depicted use. In Rise of Skywalker, when Palpatine drains Rey and Ben Solo's life force, neither of them registers what's happening as a physical attack. There's no bruising, no wound, no traceable physical mechanism, just phantom white streams, visible to the audience as force-based, invisible to anyone in the scene without force sensitivity. Ben Solo collapses not from injury, but from depletion. His force connection emptied into Palpatine, his body left without the animating energy sustaining it. Rey heals him by transferring her own force life, a reversal of exactly the same mechanic. No biological damage was done. The mechanism operated entirely through the Force. A medical droid scanning Ben Solo in that moment would have found the same thing the Polis Massa droid found with Padme. A biological organism in systemic failure with no identifiable physical cause. We don't know why. Now, Palpatine is on Coruscant. Padme is dying on Polis Massa. Between those two locations, while the medical droid is reaching that conclusion, the film cuts repeatedly between the two events, not sequentially, but simultaneously. Darth Vader is being rebuilt in Palpatine's facility. His destroyed body is being re-engineered. Prosthetic limbs attached, synthetic skin grafted, ventilator mechanisms fitted. The suit's chest plate seals. The iconic black helmet descends and locks. Vader draws his first mechanical breath, the sound filling Palpatine's chamber. Simultaneously, the film insists on simultaneously. Padmé's life signs are weakening on Polis Massa. Back to Vader, standing for the first time. Back to Padmé, going still. The academic text Star Wars and Philosophy Strikes Back confirms the intercutting as intentional editorial architecture. The reconstruction of Anakin into Darth Vader and the death of Padmé are presented as parallel, simultaneous events through deliberate cinematic intercutting. Filmmakers who wanted to show these as sequential events, Vader completed, then Padmé died, could have cut the film that way. They chose not to. The intercutting is a directorial claim about the relationship between these two events. What that claim means is the debate. That it was deliberately made isn't. The theory's proposed mechanism. Palpatine, in his Coruscant facility, was drawing on Padmé's life force to sustain Vader's reconstruction. Vader's injuries from Mustafar were catastrophic. Destroyed lungs, burns across most of the body, multiple amputated limbs. The biological baseline being rebuilt was barely viable. Life force transfer, drawn from Padmé through her force bond with Anakin, would be the missing variable that made the reconstruction viable rather than fatal. Padmé's decline maps perfectly to Vader's completion. She doesn't die before the suit seals. She dies after. The counter-arguments require honest treatment because dismissing them would undermine the documentary case rather than strengthen it. The simplest objection, force choke injuries combined with catastrophic grief, are sufficient to explain Padmé's death without invoking force drain. She was physically strangled on Mustafar. The psychological devastation of watching Anakin commit his atrocities, betray everything he was, and turn on her personally was extreme and immediate. Lost the will to live maps coherently onto severe depression following acute trauma. A psychosomatic collapse the medical droid might identify as absence of will because that's the biological presentation of what happened, not because something supernatural intervened. This is a real argument, and the force choke injuries are real. The medical record would include them. Any honest account of Padmé's death has to acknowledge that she arrived at Polis Massa already physically damaged and psychologically devastated. Two places where it develops tension. Padmé Amidala faced Trade Federation occupation as a teenager and organized underground resistance rather than collapse. She spent years challenging Palpatine's political consolidation from the Senate floor, often as one of a small minority doing so, with full knowledge of the personal risk. She survived multiple assassination attempts, the Battle of Geonosis, the Separatist Crisis, and 4 years of galactic war without losing the capacity for political agency. She carried twins to full term under wartime conditions and delivered them safely, arguing that this particular woman abandoned the will to live, within hours of giving birth, with 2 newborn children present, one of whom she named before losing consciousness, asks the audience to accept a psychosomatic collapse that runs counter to every established characterization the film's built across 3 movies. That's a character logic argument, not a canon argument. Its force depends on how seriously you weight internal character consistency as evidence. But the pattern is distinct enough that lost the will to live, applied to Padmé Amidala, should produce more scrutiny than it typically receives. The second counter-argument uses Palpatine's own Clone Wars-era dialogue against the theory. In the opera scene, he frames Plagueis' technique as distant legend. After Anakin's fall, he offers to help Anakin save Padmé, framing the effort as a joint project contingent on Anakin's power growing in the dark side. Together, we can save her. If he already had the technique mastered, why the contingency framing? Why suggest joint effort rather than personal capability? Palpatine's manipulation across 6 films never works by demonstrating capability and demanding submission. It works by manufacturing indispensability. convincing the target that their specific power, their unique connection, their personal contribution is the variable that makes success possible. Telling Anakin, "I already know how to do this, obey me," makes the transaction naked coercion. The manipulation that actually worked, the one that bound Anakin permanently, required Anakin to believe he was uniquely necessary, that Palpatine needed his power, that this was a partnership. A man who already had the technique and needed Anakin to believe he didn't would design exactly this framing. Ancient legend, distant and humble. Joint effort contingent on Anakin's growth. The deliberate ambiguity of the opera scene is consistent with concealment of mastery, not evidence against it. The third counterargument is the one with real weight. No canon source confirms the drain happened. No film, show, novel, comic, or official guide documents Palpatine performing force drain on Padme or on anyone else during the 22 to 19 BBY period. The Rise of Skywalker instance is decades removed from the events of Revenge of the Sith. The intercut editing is circumstantial. The medical droid's line is consistent with multiple explanations. The absence of a physical cause is evidentiary, but not conclusive. One additional objection worth naming. If Palpatine was capable of force drain during the Clone Wars, why didn't he use it in combat? Against Jedi, against Mace Windu in their Rots duel when he was nearly killed, against enemies who threatened his plan. The absence of any Clone Wars-era documented use creates a logical question. The answer available within the theory's own logic is that covert practice requires exactly the kind of controlled, undetected, non-combat application that would leave no observable record. Deploying force drain against Jedi opponents in combat would have been identified and analyzed. Secret refinement of the technique would require quiet, private use. The absence of documented combat use during the Clone Wars is predicted by the premise of secret practice. It's an unfalsifiable explanation for an absence of evidence, and arguments of that structure are logically available without being logically strong. Name it rather than rely on it. There's a canon data point from decades after Revenge of the Sith that functions as a retroactive lens on everything in this case. A Springer academic source on Star Wars canon notes that in Rise of Skywalker, Palpatine requires cloning technology and an elaborate apparatus to sustain himself until he can drain sufficient life force. That context is specific to his post-Return of the Jedi state, a degraded clone body, decades after his death, requiring external mechanical support to function at all. The elaborate apparatus belongs to a physically compromised Palpatine in an extraordinary situation. It doesn't describe the mechanics of force drain as a technique requiring such apparatus under normal Sith practice conditions. A Sith Lord in full physical command of his capabilities in 19 BBY, operating from a position of absolute institutional control, wouldn't require the same infrastructure his clone body needed decades later. The comparison is instructive about continuity of the capability, not limiting about the conditions required to execute it. Palpatine's survival beyond the Death Star explosion and his return in a cloned body is confirmed in canon. This is a distinct technique from force drain, but their coexistence in his arsenal is notable. He wasn't developing one life extension capability in isolation. He was maintaining multiple simultaneous approaches to the same problem, all of them rooted in Plagueis' original framework of midi-chlorian manipulation and force-based interference with the boundary between life and death. The obsession was singular even when the techniques diverged. The Clone Wars gave Palpatine 4 years of conditions that didn't exist before 22 BBY and wouldn't exist after 19 BBY. Emergency powers eliminating institutional scheduling oversight. A galaxy-wide conflict keeping the Jedi deployed away from Coruscant. A Senate whose oversight apparatus eroded progressively across each year of the war. A Jedi Council whose dark side detection capability had been structurally complicated by its own tolerance for Vapad's practice within the Order. Term limits suspended. Both sides of the war answering to him. The laboratory had ideal conditions, and he controlled when it closed. It closed when Vader was built. What the canon establishes. Plagueis had the ability. Palpatine inherited the knowledge. Force drain is a real, documented canon technique Palpatine demonstrably mastered. The Clone Wars provided years of unmonitored private time, under conditions uniquely favorable to Force development. Padmé Amidala died on Polis Massa, with no confirmed biological cause, simultaneous with Darth Vader's reconstruction in Palpatine's Coruscant facility, in scenes the filmmakers chose to intercut deliberately rather than present sequentially. What the canon doesn't establish, that the drain happened. The gap between the circumstantial case and a confirmed account is real, and the script won't pretend otherwise. The medical droid scanned everything it knew how to scan, and said it didn't know why. The film cut to Palpatine's facility. Vader breathed. Padme didn't. If you've been watching the Year 1 through Year 4 Clone Wars timelines on this channel, you've seen Palpatine building the political architecture across those 4 years. The emergency powers, the Jar Jar vote, the Senate erosion, the elimination of term limits, the mechanisms by which the Republic became the Empire in plain sight. This video is what was running through the Force during those same months. The political track and the Force track ran in parallel. They converged in 19 BBY on a remote medical station in an asteroid field, where a woman with 2 newborn children and every established reason to survive didn't. The full Year 1 through Year 4 series links are in the pinned comment below. Subscribe for more stories like this.